So why don't more people write books? When I tell people I'm a writer, one of the most common responses I get is, "Oh my goodness, I've always wanted to write a book." To which I always respond, "You should. Why haven't you?" I think there's a million reasons why people don't write their books, but I also think that most of those reasons are not very good ones. So I'm going to start a 3-part mini-series on the Yet podcast where I explore what I think are 3 of the biggest reasons that people don't write their books. Because I believe that the world needs more great stories, and I think that your story is worth writing. So I want to do everything I can do to help encourage and inspire you to get started and to keep going. I'm calling it Bad Reasons Not to Write Your Book. Hey, my name's TC Burr. Welcome to Yet, a podcast created to encourage you to get your goal or idea out of your head and into reality. On this podcast, you'll hear stories, encouragements, tips, and ideas to help you write your book, start your business, launch your podcast, or whatever it is you hope to accomplish. Because it's not that you haven't done it, it's just that you haven't done it yet. Hi, welcome to another episode of the Yet podcast. Today on the podcast, what are you so afraid of? We're going to talk about writing specifically, and one of the big things that keeps people from writing their books, which is fear of failure. So I want to share some thoughts on that and interact with it a little bit because I actually don't think it's a good reason to not write your book. And so just cards out on the table right at the beginning. I think fear of failure is a bad reason to not write your book, or by the way, to take on any challenge. And we'll talk a little bit about why as we get into the episode. Before we get started, though, I wanted to say a couple of things. First, if you're new here, my name's TC. I am so glad that you've joined the podcast. Welcome. I'd encourage you to go back and check out the archives, but I'm glad you're here now and super thankful to have you here as a listener. I started this podcast about a year or so ago, and I did it because I wanted to share stories of other people, entrepreneurs, writers, creatives who were doing really cool things that I thought the world might want to hear about. And so I'm so glad you're here to listen, and thank you so much for joining. Also, in general, even if you're not new, the other thing I wanted to say, if I haven't said it lately, is thank you, listener, for being here. People create podcasts for lots of reasons, but one of the main reasons should be to provide benefit to the listener, because without listeners, there's no point in doing podcasts, right? Like I could talk into this microphone, but without you, then what are we doing? What's the point? So if you are a listener, you've been here for any amount of time. If you're new, and especially if you've been here for a while, thank you so very much. If you haven't done it yet, please go and rate and review the show. I've gotten some really good feedback on this podcast, both in my personal networks with folks that I know personally and through the podcast app and other channels. So if you haven't done that already, please do. And those of you who have, thank you. Your kind words mean so much to me. So thank you. Okay. Let's get into it. So, did you know that according to at least some research, 80% of Americans say that they want to write a book? 80%. That's a lot of people. That number might be alarming to you because how many writers do you know? I don't know. 80% of the people I know are not writing a book. And in fact, the same statistic that says 80% of people want to write a book would go on to say that somewhere between 1 and 3% of people ever actually do it. Why is that? Well, let's first talk about why people want to write books. And here's my theory. I believe that we as a people, humans in general, have been created to resonate with stories. That's the reason why movies are so popular, books are so popular, plays are popular. My wife and I love going to musicals. And so just this idea of stories, and even think back in, the olden days, before we had TV and all these types of entertainment, people what did they do? They would sit around a campfire and share stories. I think it's a natural part of the human experience to want to connect to good and beautiful stories. And by the way, not just as consumers of stories, I think we all have a story to tell. And that's one of the reasons why, I'm using this podcast to encourage particularly writers to tell their story. But it's also why I've invited guests to join this show, because I think every story matters and everybody has a story that's worth sharing, that others will connect with and resonate with and be inspired and encouraged by. So I think why people want to write, it's just kind of embedded in who we are as humans. So if that's true, then why don't they? Well, there's a lot of reasons why people don't end up writing their books, which I'm going to deal with in future episodes. But for this one, I'm going to deal with what I think is probably the primary reason people don't write, and that is fear of failure. By the way, this is not just true statistically, the 80% of people that want to write, but so few ever do. I've actually noticed that in my own experience too. So, one of the things that I started to do once I began writing my novel is I started sharing that with people in conversation. So, if I'm at work or at church or, people in my neighborhood, they'll kind of ask what's new in my life. And this is a big thing that's happening right now. So, I will share them. Hey, I'm writing a book. And I get a lot of different responses, but one of the really frequent responses that I would get when I would tell people this is, "Oh my gosh, that's so cool. I've always wanted to write a book." And so I'll interact with that a little bit usually and say, "Well, you should." "Oh, I could never do that." And I'll press and say, "Why not? I think you can. I think you should." There's a whole backstory with that, but somebody did that with me when I was just kind of kicking around the idea. And that always stuck with me, that encouragement and that push to, hey, don't just let that die with an idea. Actually go and do it. But I think a reason why many people don't is because they're afraid of failure. And so, what is failure? I think it's important to define our terms. Well, in its simplest definition, failure is just a lack of success, right? You set out to do something and you don't achieve that thing. And success is obviously, right, like you say, you have a goal and you want to hit that goal. And if you don't meet that goal, then therefore you have failed. But I think we have an opportunity, and I think I would encourage us to actually think about redefining what failure means and maybe what success means for us too. So I do think it's super important to have goals. I've talked about that in other episodes. I'll continue to talk about that because I think having goals, measuring your goals, tracking your goals, adjusting your goals is all super important to making progress. But I also want to make sure that we're setting goals that are realistic and that we don't let ourselves get burdened and overwhelmed by, quote, failure when we don't meet the highest possible goals that we set for ourselves. So, what if we redefined failure as learning? What if we redefine failure as growing and discovering and exploring? What if we gave ourselves, in a sense, the freedom to fail because we recognize that that is part of the process of growing and getting better? So I am a novice, kind of an amateur weightlifter. So I go to the gym, I work out, lift weights. And in weightlifting, there is this concept of lifting to the point of what's called failure. And that is what it sounds like. You put a bunch of weight on the bar, you lift it until you cannot lift it any further. And not everybody does this, but some people who are trying to gain weight, for example, build up muscle mass, they will lift until failure. And the idea is that this failure is actually part of the process. It's the point. You're doing it to fail. And in that failing, quote, you're actually getting stronger. You're actually getting better so that the next time you get underneath that weight, you're able to lift more and more. Your strength improves and you get better at that lift. And so I think it's appropriate and really helpful to take a similar approach when it comes to our writing. So just because you don't hit all of the goals that you set out to hit does not mean that you're a failure. I'll give you a good example. My first draft of my novel, I had a time bound word count that I wanted to hit. And I wanted to hit, I think it was like 60,000 words by the end of the year. And I had like 4 months to do it or whatever. And I ended up writing like 55,000 words. So I could have interpreted that as, oh no, I didn't hit my goal. I'm never going to make it. I might as well just give up now. But what I chose to do instead was say, hey, I'm 55,000 words further along than I would have been if I set that goal in the first place. And so even though technically I failed on my goal in that scenario, it still counted as a major win. It counted as a learning opportunity, a growth opportunity for me. I got so much better at writing through that process. And I realized that, hey, maybe I should have recalibrated. Maybe I didn't factor in the fact that I would be traveling for the holidays and wouldn't have as much time to write or whatever. Right. But I still was much better off in terms of my writing progress than I would have been if I let that fear of failure discourage me from ever getting started. So I do think it's important for us again to have goals, to set goals and to measure goals. So it's critically important to have goals that are measurable, right? So don't just say I want to write, make it tangible for yourself. Set a word count goal or set a days of the week goal, right? I want to write 5 days a week for X number of weeks or whatever it is, so that you can actually track that and look back to see your progress. By the way, if you want help with that, I created a free resource which has helped me a ton. It's called 5 Steps to Supercharge Your Goals. You can find it at tcburr.com. It's absolutely free. Go check it out. I think it will help. But it is important to have measurable, trackable goals, because then you have the data to make informed decisions about what to do next. And I've talked about that in previous episodes. Go download that resource, check it out. I think it'll help you a lot. But it's also important, and this is where I think a lot of writers in particular kind of get it wrong. It's also important to let the thing that you measure be something that's within your control. So a couple of examples of what I would say are not great goals for writers would be, for example, having your book land on a New York Times bestseller list. That's a good dream. That's a good aspiration. That's a good thing to hope happens. But there are so many variables and so many factors that play into that are completely outside of your control. And so you're setting yourself up in a way for failure if that's your goal, because there are, again, so many variables in that formula that are outside of your control. It might happen. I hope that it does for you. But a lot of that's outside the scope of your control. A better goal might be, I'm going to sit down and write 1,000 words per week. You have complete control over your schedule. You have complete control over the discipline of sitting down to write, and you have control of actually doing that, putting that rep in and doing that work. And then the results are going to come as a result of that process and that discipline that you do over and over. So getting on a bestseller list, a great thing to aim for, but I don't think it's a good goal in these terms. Your goal should be something that you can actually measure and that you can actually control. So likewise, sales goals, I don't think are super helpful for authors. You want to sell books, obviously, but a better goal might be, hey, I'm going to dedicate a budget, this much of my budget toward marketing, or I'm going to market my book in these places, in these ways that you can track and measure. Those are things that you have control over. And then people buying your book or not, well, that's kind of up to the market, right? But it's up to you to get the word out and do your thing. So I hope that makes sense. Set good goals, set measurable goals, but set goals that you can track and that you can control. But let's get back to talking about fear. So I think, again, fear of failure is a reason why so many people don't get started. And I think we have an opportunity to redefine what success and failure look like in our writing. It's not New York Times bestseller or bust. It should be, let me write this thing. Let me set some goals and get this thing down on paper and get it to publish and get it to, do what I have to do to get the book out there, and then call that success. It doesn't have to be the biggest and baddest, biggest and best every single time, or else it's a failure. And even where you do fall short, again, think of the weightlifting analogy. That kind of comes with the territory of writing, or really any type of creative endeavor. If you're stepping out to do something big, you're opening yourself up to stumbling along the way, to falling short. But don't view those as death sentences to your work. View them as opportunities to learn, to grow, and to get better. Our fears, by the way, are very often unfounded and imagined. So I've got a couple of illustrations that I want to share that I think, for me at least, connect to this idea. So I don't know where I heard this example. I wish I could give the person credit because I thought it was brilliant. I think it was a podcast I was listening to, but it may have been an audiobook or some other source. But I heard it somewhere. It's not original to me, but it's two people having a conversation, one very young and one very old. And so I picture a young man, like a teenager, maybe talking to his great grandfather on the front porch. That's the picture that I had in my mind. And the kid has these big ideas of, going into business or doing a big thing, and he's talking to his great grandfather who's got decades of wisdom and experience, done all these great things over the course of his life. And he sits down with him and says, great grandpa, tell me what's the best advice you could give me, which I think is a great question to ask someone, especially someone you admire, someone who's done some great things. Like, ask for their advice, soak up the wisdom that they've accumulated along their journey. So anyway, in this example, this kid asks the great grandfather type man, what's the best advice you can give me in terms of setting out and pursuing these goals and dreams? And the old man says to him, you know, as I consider the course of my life, I've accomplished a lot of great things. I've done a lot of things. One thing that as I kind of survey the landscape of my, 100 years on earth, the one thing that I've noticed is I have faced so many challenges. There have been so many crises that have arisen in my life. And he paused and looks off in the distance and he says, and some of them actually happened, which I just thought was such a cool example because it speaks to this idea that when we set out to do something big, oftentimes our initial response is fear of, what if the worst case scenario happens? What if I put myself out there and I fall flat on my face? What if nobody reads it? What if I'm exposed as a fraud or a terrible writer? What if my imposter syndrome that's been dogging me since I set out to do this is actually true and I really stink at this? But he says, his point is, listen, so much of that is just in your head. So much of those worst case scenarios are things that are never going to take place, but we allow ourselves to just kind of marinate on those and think about, oh my goodness, what if this bad thing happens? And that can put up a block for us. That can cause us to never actually make progress. And so we imagine the worst case scenarios. Most of them never will take place. But here's the other thing. Even if those things do take place, I don't think they're as bad as we anticipate they're going to be. Like, I don't know what we expect. If we sit down to write a book, so say you spend the next 6 months to a year working out a draft, getting it edited, going through beta readers, all, everything you have to do, designing the cover, printing it, getting it out, and you publish your book out in the world. And what do we think? People are going to read it and like send us hate mail. Like, this is such a terrible book. Why did you ever write? Like, probably that's not going to happen. Like, one of the things that I've learned since I started writing and getting on social media and creating podcasts is like, most people don't care. Like, most people are so busy with their own thing, their own life, their family, their work, their, whatever it is that they're working on, that like they're not really paying as close attention to your mistakes or your shortcomings or where you fall short, or if it takes longer for you to do something than you thought it might take. Like, you feel that because that's where your focus is. But most people are really oblivious to it. So there's not going to be this scenario where you go out and publish your book and realize like, oh no, everyone's laughing at me. I'm like the laughing stock of the literary world. That's probably not going to happen. So even if the worst case scenario does happen, it's not going to be as bad as we think. And again, even if it doesn't hit some measure of success that we imagine, we still have the value of the experience of going through the process. We learn along the way. We have the satisfaction of knowing that we've done it. And all of those are wins in my book. And so the fear of failure really is not a good reason to not move forward. I think you should still write your book, even if you're afraid. I have one more story to kind of illustrate this. This is more of a fun one from my family. So around Halloween last year, a little bit, probably, I guess, late September, early October, my kids and I were driving to school or somewhere. And in my neighborhood, lots of people decorate their houses for Halloween. And one of the trends that's become popular where I live is these huge, like super tall skeletons. I don't know if they have those where you are, and some people have decided they're just going to leave those guys up all year. They put little Santa hats on them during Christmas and Hawaiian shirts during the summer. It's kind of, I guess, cool. I don't know. But there's this one house that we would drive by, and it had one of these big, huge, like inflatable dragons. It was like this black, just very imposing looking, looked like a fire breathing dragon, right? Kind of thing. and it had these illuminated red eyes, like super scary looking thing. And my 5-year-old son would not let me drive by that house. Like he knew where it was. And so he see us start going that route. He said, Dad, take a different road, take a different route. Please don't go that way. That big scary guy, I don't want to go near him. And he was afraid, like legitimately scared of this thing. And I remember there was a day we started going out and we were wherever we were going on that particular day, we had to take that route, had to go by that house. And I was prepared to say, hey, buddy, listen, we're going to go. You can look the other way. It's going to be fine, just whatever. But I didn't have to do it because we started driving. And I think something clicked with him. He realized as we were driving, before we got there, he said, hey, Dad, you know that big scary thing? And I said, yeah, buddy. I'm getting ready to tell him, like, it's okay. Don't worry. And he says, hey, that's just a blow up. And I kind of laughed. I said, what do you mean? He's like, it's not real. It's just a blow up. Like it's fake. And his whole perspective changed. Once he realized that the thing he had been so afraid of, the thing that he had been literally terrified to get anywhere near was all in his head, it had no substance whatsoever. And so from then on, he was mocking that thing. We would drive by it and he would point and laugh and say, hey, brother or sister, this thing is fake. It's not. Like he knew that it was just full of hot air. There was no substance in his fear and it couldn't do anything to hurt him. Guys, I think that's true with our fears too. I think that we're afraid of so many things that we imagine in our heads. But if you really sit back and examine it, there's only benefit to going for your goal. Whether you succeed, or surpass your wildest expectations or not, you're still going to have the value of knowing you did it. You're still going to go through the experience. You're still going to learn. You're still going to grow. Even if you don't hit the metrics that you had hoped to, it's still going to be a positive thing. So don't let the fear of failure stop you from writing your book. The world needs more great stories. And I believe that you have a story to tell. So please, please, please go and write it. Thanks. Later. Hey, thanks so much for listening to today's episode. If you would do me a huge favor, if you got value out of this podcast, which I'm assuming maybe you did since you're still here, would you scroll down to the bottom of your podcast app and rate and review the show? And maybe share it with someone on social media or with a friend just in a conversation. It would mean so much to get this message out to more people, and I think it would be amazing if you would share it. So that would be, as a personal favor to me, I'd really love it. Also, if you want to know more about me and what I'm working on, you can visit my website. It's tcburr.com. I hope you'll check it out. You can contact me there. Thanks again, and I really appreciate it. I'll talk to you soon.